My story starts around climate change in 2006, in which I was working in Washington, D.C. for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, a Quaker lobbying organization, doing peace work and reading a book by Elizabeth Colbert called Field Notes from a Catastrophe, in which she spent a long time writing for the New Yorker, going around and visiting many of the places around the world where climate change was visible and where scientists were actually measuring the changes that were affecting on the planet. And the end of that book, I found myself reading out on a beautiful grassy lawn east of the Capitol. And beautiful, I keep thinking of it as a summer day, but it was in April, which is summer in Washington, D.C., with tears falling from my face, because it was clear that the climate issue was going to transcend all of the good work that friends and others had been doing for change. And that if we didn't get this piece of the puzzle right, if we didn't fix this problem, peace and security, working on civil liberties certainly, and any of the other smaller environmental issues that I had grown up caring so deeply about weren't going to be able to be addressed. It's hard to create peace on Earth when half the population can't feed itself. It's not going to be a pretty sight. And I think the strongest reaction that I was having was that it was clear from my time in Washington that the mechanisms of kind of standard progressive political change weren't going to be sufficient to address this mammoth problem. Lobbying within the power structure as it existed and exists isn't going to get the job done, because we need to build power and have a movement. Which led me to moving back to my hometown. I spent a couple of years trying to find a way forward to do this work. I worked with student organizations for a number of years, started a climate organizing training program for students, and something still wasn't fitting. This piecemeal work didn't seem to address the problem in a dramatic enough and clear-headed enough way. And I was struggling to see how the work that I was doing was going to in any way bring the sort of change that we needed. And so I ended up quitting much of the work that I was doing and withdrawing actually to be with friends for a couple of years. And was really grateful to find some colleagues, some young adult friend colleagues, Catherine Fisher of Beacon Hill, Emily Newman of Fresh Pond Weeding, and Abe Drayton as well. And we started working what we called the Climate Working Group. We didn't do anything outwardly for quite some time. And I was looking for examples of what people could do that was commensurate with the challenge. I was really, and I think the lightning bolt moment for me was finally seeing the story and reading the story of a man by the name of Tim DeChristopher in an interview that he did in Orion magazine in 2012 with Terry Tempest Williams. How many people know Tim DeChristopher's story? Well, briefly, Tim was a student in Salt Lake City, Utah, and he had been involved with a bunch of groups who were protesting a proposed oil and gas lease auction that the Bush administration was going to have in Salt Lake City. And Tim showed up outside the auction with probably a couple of hundred other folks there, picketing, trying to make their point that drilling and fracking in beautiful, beautiful canyon lands next to Arches National Park was a bad idea. And he ended up walking into the auction, and the people behind the table said, "Well, are you here for the auction?" And he said, "Well, yes I am." And they said, "Are you here to be a bidder?" And he said, "Well, I guess I am." And they gave him a bidder's paddle, and he walked into the auction and sat down, pretty nervous, and then started bidding on parcels of land to drive up the price, so that at least the oil and gas companies would have to be paying more for this and weren't just going to get away with the bargain basement prices that they were hoping for. And then he had a realization that he could actually start winning parcels. And he just kept bidding. And he won something like a dozen parcels of leases for a dozen parcels of land. And throwing that lease into that auction into chaos, and so that all of the parcels eventually from that auction were never leased. The auction was thrown out as illegal once the Obama administration came in, and all that land ended up being protected. In return for that, despite the Obama administration declaring the auction illegal, Tim spent 18 months in federal prison for fraud, having bid as not an actual oil company.
18 months?
I believe it was 18, either 18 or 20.
I think it was 20.
Somewhere in there, yeah. For the first time for me, I saw, wait, here is someone who is acting in a way commensurate with the problem, who is saying the problem is immediate, it is huge, and I can't go about my normal everyday life as if everything was going to be okay. And Tim, at the time, was kind of a lone wolf in this. There were few others. First of all, there's been no one who's around climate change has committed themselves that far that ended up being punished that severely. And second, he was someone who was demanding and putting his body on the line to say, we have to stop doing this drilling, we have to stop doing this burning of fossil fuels, we have to stop doing this business as usual. I want to take a little break from talking and show you a little bit of a video that gets to at least how I see Tim in this movement. It's pretty short. So
if you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch the movement happen, start to finish in under 3 minutes, and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow him. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be the first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is over-glorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
Tim was my lone nut. He is a nut. It's true. But he's not alone anymore, thankfully.
Lights.
Lights.
Down below.
Oh,
The one's down below. Oh, the other, yeah, okay.
Great. It takes risk. It takes risk. That's what the guy in the video kept saying. Not just to be the dancing guy, because he's probably a lone nut. But it takes risk to be the first followers. And I think my purpose being here is that we're still at the first follower stage in this movement. We're still at the stage of actually looking at Tim and a few other people and saying, are they just crazy? Or are we going to fall in line with them and join them? So, about a year before I ended up embarking on this Little Lobster Boat journey, had been involved with lobbying campaigns and been involved with, like I said, student organizing, and kind of emblematic of where we were in the lobbying was that we had in 2008, in Massachusetts passed a Global Warming Solutions Act. I don't know if you have one of those here in Connecticut. Yes, great. So the Global Warming Solutions Acts, as they were called and passed in maybe a half a dozen or a dozen states, had the goal of, in line with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment at the time, trying to stop total emissions before they reached 450 parts per million. You might know some other parts per million numbers that have bounced around. It was then in Massachusetts, it was 3 months after Massachusetts passed their bill that Dr. James Hansen came out with his first paper that said, actually, guys, the target needs to be 350. Since we were already at around 390 and we're now well over 400 at this point, that was cause for us to go back and do some more lobbying and say, actually, dear state legislature, the job isn't done, you haven't solved climate. And we ended up bringing Dr. Hansen up through a whole series of actions and work through the fall, and he came up and was lobbying with us, and we were in a meeting. I was in a meeting with him and the co-chairs of the climate change committees, Joint Climate Change Committee in the Massachusetts State House, in which we explained the new science and said, well, we should update the law in line with the science. And one of the co-chairs of that committee said, well, thank you very much for your presentation, but we really have already done climate change. And so there's really nothing else we can do. I thought we had a system that was based on reason and we could learn new things and change. Guess not. It was pretty dispiriting for me. And all of that work seemed like it was going nowhere because people didn't seem to understand and connect both in their brains and their hearts what was really going on. After that period of time, I started warming up with Tim's example to the idea that it was time to do direct action. And for those of you who aren't Quakers, we'll throw a little terminology out there. Friends have a phrase called way, an understanding about the way opens. The idea of that is that when something is right, the door will be opened to you to do it. I was trying to figure out how to do some direct action. I had been talking with friends around New England, had been talking with some of the organizations who were trying to close the coal plants in Massachusetts. There wasn't anyone who was really psyched to do some direct action at that point. But on the eve of Hurricane Sandy, there was an ongoing day and night vigil in Boston, trying to get the then Senate candidates Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown to talk about climate in the elections. They had completely ignored it, unsurprisingly. And the night I was up there, the wind was starting to blow, the rain was starting to come, and there was about 10 of us that were like holding out under some tarps, trying to keep our little candle lanterns lit in the wind, and trying to stay warm, huddled together in Government Center. At around 3 a.m., my friend Ken came with an enormous thermos of hot cider and said, Jay, I have an idea. Let's get a boat and block the ship at Brayton Point. And my heart leapt. It was one of those moments where I knew that was exactly the right thing to do. I was the guy who'd been working on boats and working in boatyards and working on tall ships and teaching sailing and being able to do all the boat things for almost my entire life. Ken had been doing environmental stuff his entire life. He was a co-founder of the US PIRGs. He was founder of New Jersey PIRG. He was a co-founder of Green Corps. He was a co-founder of the National Environmental Law Center, and he was a former deputy director of Greenpeace. And it was really clear that this was the work that we needed to do together. That was in October of 2012. And that sense of way opening and the path being clear for us to do this work has proceeded ever since. I think that means we were onto something. We bought a boat. We tracked the coal ship that ran between Norfolk, Virginia and Brayton Point, named the Energy Enterprise. We got a team of really great people together to help us do media and support and backup work for the action. We painted the boat, and then on the Friday before the action was on Wednesday. On the Friday before, we didn't know when the boat was going in the water. The boatyard it was at was kind of weird. And they just called up and were like, well, your boat's going in tomorrow. And you're like, oh, okay. So it showed up on Friday, and the boat went in the water, and it being a 50-year-old wooden lobster boat, started sinking rapidly. She was headed down, and the boatyard had unplugged the plug that we had charging the batteries at some point, so the batteries were dead. So I was sitting there with the manual bilge pump, pumping every minute and a half for a good 2 minutes, and trying to call Ken on the phone, being like, Ken, I can't leave the boat. I know you're about an hour away, but could you get down here and buy a pump? The boat stayed afloat. The engine didn't go underwater. Everything seemed to be working out. 2 days later, the boat had swelled up. She was not pumping nearly as much. The batteries got charged. But we still couldn't get the engine to turn over. And it actually wasn't until the Monday before the action on Wednesday. On Monday, we finally got the engine to start. A little ether, a little, kicking, little prayer. And for some reason, I don't know what actually changed, but the engine decided to roll over. Vroom. Got to do a little lap around Newport Harbor. We had been tracking this ship because ships' tracks are available publicly online. You can actually look up where every ship is around. And we knew that this boat was just doing this regular run between Norfolk, where there's an enormous, has anyone been to Norfolk, Virginia? There's a huge coal terminal there where they take 4 train cars at a time and dump them upside down. It happens every 30 seconds. It's just continual. And the freight line out of Norfolk is just this perfectly graded plain from the mountains of West Virginia. They just coast on down, full of coal. We knew that it took about 3.5 days or something between when the boat left the dock in Norfolk and when the boat arrived in the mouth of Narragansett Bay. But in the intervening time, you can't see the boat because it's too far off the shore to be picked up by any of the trackers. So you have to kind of hope that it, in fact, is going to arrive on time. We didn't know the night before we did the action whether the boat was going to arrive that day or not. But we had come down to Newport and we're ready to go and said, well, it's either going to come now or it's not going to come. It did come. I told you about Brayton Point, right? Biggest coal-fired power plant in New England. Maybe not. Brayton Point. Single largest source of emissions in New England. On this bit of land, named for a family by the last name of Brayton, who were members of the Swansea League. And Patience Brayton, in the late 1700s, Patience, the woman, just to genderize that, so we get an idea of who is going and doing this in the late 1700s, was a recorded minister, and she traveled all the way down to South Carolina after her family freed their slaves, traveling under a concern for abolition, by herself, left her husband to take care of the kids in the farm, and picked up a friend as an elder to go with her from Long Island, and spent almost half a year or a year traveling all the way down the length of the length of the colonies in the United States. So there's some awesome Quaker history, Brayton Point.
Is that what I can see from 95?
From 195, yep, and there's 2 huge cooling towers. This is a little moment of anger, right? The environmentalists spent a decade trying to get this power plant to add a whole bunch of better scrubbers so they weren't polluting the air as much, and to build the cooling towers so they weren't warming up Mount Hope Bay. Laudable. Except for, you just forced a power plant to make $1 billion worth of investment that they're going to want to burn coal for decades more to pay off. At 6 a.m. on Wednesday, May 15th, we had a short prayer meeting on the dock at Newport. with my friend Marla, who was our media spokesperson and our spiritual center for the day and the action. And set off under a brilliant cloudless blue sky with not a breath of wind north up Narragansett Bay towards Somerset. We anchored our little white lobster boat with a big 350 banner and a banner with the hashtag cold is stupid on top of it, right off the coal pier. And first we dropped our little boat-sized anchor, and then we dropped our 200-pound mushroom mooring anchor that was chained to the keel, making ourselves immovable. Lo and behold, way continued to open. The Wi-Fi hotspot that wasn't working on the way up started to work. The iPad that we had bought to live stream the whole thing, we figured out how to live stream it because we hadn't really gotten that to work before. And lo and behold, on the way up, because we got the internet working, we could check to make sure that, in fact, the Energy Enterprise was starting to come up from Newport. We waited. We were boarded. We waited for almost an hour after we dropped anchor and called the Somerset police to let them know of our action and our intent, telling them that we were a non-violent, peaceful protest. Took them 2 phone calls to actually figure out what we were doing. We were boarded by the Coast Guard. There were three charming young gentlemen who came on board. And they spent the next 6.5 or 7 hours hanging out with us on the boat, trying to figure out what to do with us. We were cooperative and friendly and peaceful. We were happy to talk with them and let them know what was going on. And we told them that we had this 200-pound anchor which was chained to the keel and that we really couldn't be moved. In the meantime, the Energy Enterprise came in and kind of half-docked on the pier in a way that she would be safely up against the pier, but not in a place where she could have unloaded her coal. You can kind of see the Coast Guard guy hanging out there. We first tried to remedy the situation for them. They asked us if we would move, and we said, well, yes, especially if you're threatening us with enormous fines. So we attempted to move. We attempted first to take a hacksaw and cut the chain that we managed to fish up from under the boat with this weird hook that we found on the boat. And about a quarter of the way through that process, we heard from the Coast Guard that even though they had said, oh, go ahead, go for it, their higher up on the phone said, actually, no, you can't do that. You have to stop. And they were like, oh, okay, well, I guess I have to stop, guys. And then we were like, well, can we just try and pull it up by hand? And they said, well, yeah, we'll help you. We'll try and pull it up by hand. And they were starting to lay into it. And then they got the phone call from the higher up and said, no, you guys can't help them. Okay, cool. So Ken and I spent a couple of hours trying with various pulley mechanisms and lever arms and things to try and pull this anchor back on board, while the Coast Guard were diligently holding onto our life jackets to make sure we didn't fall overboard. We spent a lot of time waiting. We were telling jokes. They showed us how to use the radar. Talked about boats. And eventually the state police dive team came down from Framingham, Massachusetts. With all their gear, they were really excited to go see that, in fact, there was a 200-pound mushroom anchor that we had put on the bottom. And although an interesting fact, we just found this out, the dive report, we got to see from our lawyers, they had the report from the dive team, and there's a section on the diving report that says bottom, conditions of the bottom. And the other box was checked and it said coal sludge. Which might have something to do with why we couldn't get this thing out of the bottom. Well, the point about way opening that I want to make is that I believe when we're acting from our deep center and acting out of our true purpose in accordance with the truth as we understand it, that new things, new life, new understanding breaks into the world in a way that sitting back and criticizing and speaking does not. For me, that's why direct action is important. It's transformative in a way that other things are not. I think our interaction with the Coast Guard was one of those ways that was evidence of our acting from our true concern. And our concern wasn't with the Coast Guard. We were very happy to have conversations with them. Our concern was with the coal. And so in blocking the coal, instead of picking a fight with the authorities in some way, their hearts, I think, were in some ways opened. To the point that once the state police dive team got the key to the lock out of my pocket, gave it to them, they unlocked the chain from the keel of the boat. Ken and I were sitting in the cabin, and there was a fourth Coast Guard guy and a state police officer that by that time on the boat, and the head Coast Guard guy comes in and is like, "Hey guys, here's your lock back." Not the way most protests normally go. But that's the spirit with which the whole thing was conducted. And I think the key to what has come since. We ended up motoring out of Brayton Point under our own power around 6 p.m. and motoring over the Fall River and having a Portuguese dinner that could not be beat. With no charges brought against us at the time, not having been arrested, and the only thing, it had been made clear that we were going to face $40,000 worth of fines per day if we stayed there, but we complied since we felt our job had been done through our blockade and the ensuing bureaucratic snafu with the various authorities. We had done our job to block the ship for 12 hours or so. And so we left and awaited our fate. That summer, and this might be our dancing guy moment, that summer in July, over 350 people were at the gates of the plant demanding its immediate closure. 24 or so folks, 4 dozen people risked and were arrested at the gates of the plant to show their commitment to seeing that plant and all of coal burning in Massachusetts shut down. In August, there was another march that started near the plant and marched for a week to Cape Cod, to the site of what will hopefully be the country's first offshore wind farm. And then in October of 2013, the plant owners announced the planned closure of the plant by 2017. Now that's not soon enough. The science tells us we need to stop burning coal now. And particularly in New England and other progressive areas of the country, we need to be a model for the nation so that the nation can be a model for the world, so that we can stop burning coal, as Dr. Hansen says we need to, by 2030. While we didn't stop the plant from burning coal at this point, it's still, in fact, we believe, burning almost twice as much coal as it did 2 years ago. We did help spark a movement of people who are committed to seeing a bigger transformation happen. And I'm hopeful that as more of these sorts of actions happen, that moral clarity starts to infuse more and more of the protests that are happening around the country. Now, I'm going to turn this over to my partner Meg to talk a little bit. Because while it's important to have some crazy dancing guys up there. We're not all called to be on the lobster boat. But we all, I believe, have a powerful and risky role that needs to be played. And Meg's going to talk a little bit about her journey around that.
So we're not all called to be on the lobster boat. And I've spent a lot of time contemplating where that leaves me. Besides being at home alone and pretty freaked out about the forecast for the climate. I was working as a professional activist, getting paid to stir up trouble for a few years, and pretty quickly found that I was desperately unhappy doing that work. I was waking up in the morning with my jaw kind of just clenched shut from the stress. And when I quit, I found I was carrying this burden. Because on one hand, the work that I thought was most important to do for the sake of the planet and the future didn't seem to line up with my own personal happiness. And that's a heartbreaking dilemma. How do I make a choice that feels selfish in the face of the crisis that we're facing? And what role do I have being at home and doing work that makes me happy and keeps me safe when we're not safe? Especially not with what's supposed to come. How do we reconcile our own needs with the needs of the world? So Rilke's quote on this has been tremendously helpful for me. He talks about, I'm not going to remember the words exactly, but in Letters to a Young Poet, he talks about living the questions, not searching for the answers now because they could not be given to you, but maybe one day you'll live your way into the answers. My own story of finding my way into getting arrested for the sake of the climate is more modest than buying my own lobster boat and going out kind of as a lone wolf with my own bitters paddle. But it's been a touch of a place that I can see is my power in this movement, and I believe we all have a role to play. And I believe that for me, my role is going to be with others, that we need to do this together. That's where the power is, and that's where my own personal happiness is, and that's where they align. Hurricane Irene came to Vermont, where I was living for the last 10 years, in 2011. And after a day of constant rain, we saw the news of covered bridges getting swept down the rivers, homes being filled with water, even graveyards being ripped into and the coffins literally just floating downstream. It was a week that climate was particularly on my mind. About a month earlier, I had received an invitation from two of my personal heroes, Wendell Berry and Bill McKibben, had invited all of us to go down to Washington, D.C. and sit on the sidewalk in front of the White House and be arrested for the sake of the climate in opposition to the plans for the tar sands pipeline that would take the tar sands from Alberta down to Texas. And I had contemplated that level of risk seriously. It wasn't a risk that I was really prepared to take, and I don't see myself sort of in opposition to authorities very easily, and so the thought of getting arrested was hard to stomach. So I hadn't committed myself. And here it was the same week as Hurricane Irene got pinned to Vermont that people continued to go and sit in the place in front of the White House considered the picture postcard zone, and the National Park Service would come and issue warnings and then eventually cordon off the area and arrest everyone who had been sitting there. This had been happening for day after day after day, and perhaps even some of you were down there for those events. And the day of Irene, I received an email from the farm that I had been a CSA member of. And they said, the river which borders our farm, that was basically, it's a floodplain sort of farm, the river is rising. And we know that by tomorrow afternoon, our crops are going to be underwater. It was August, the height of the growing season. They had thousands and thousands of dollars of ripe produce sitting in the fields, and they needed everyone that could spare the morning to go down and pull in what crops they could. So I went down the next morning, and we worked pretty frantically. We were harvesting cabbages the size of softballs rather than, the nice and full heads. And after we moved on from the cabbages into the pepper field, I noticed that the river had swollen out of her banks and was now covering the cabbage field where we had just been. And after we moved out of the pepper field and into the butternut squash field, again, it was sort of like the rivers was just rising all around us, and suddenly we were just on the only dry land that was remaining. Eventually they told us we had to leave, and we were really emergency evacuated at that point from the field. I can't remember why I chose to walk out of that field instead of riding on the tractor, which even the tractor was up to sort of its hubcaps in water. But for some reason I found myself wading out of the floodwaters with water just rushing past me, up to my mid-thigh. And I would say that's one of the moments when I've heard the Spirit most clearly. As a Quaker, that sense of light and knowing this Spirit embodied, for me, really was fundamentally started when I heard so clearly for the first time, the only response to this flood is to go to DC. It was crystal clear that I was called to be in front of the White House, and I needed to get arrested. And it was a weekend that Vermonters were responding by going to their neighbors' houses and helping muck out the basements, and cleaning up the damage. And yet I knew that my response wasn't at the local level, that I needed to go and try to address the root cause, and that we would be facing this level of flooding and more severe flooding in the future. Sitting in front of the White House, a few days later, it started to thunderstorm while we were sitting there. And the police had cordoned off the area, and they were giving us our final warnings for leaving the area or we would be arrested. And yet it was one of those moments of sitting on the sidewalk and knowing that I was sitting in the right place. There was just that clear light of knowing that my heart and my mind and my body were finally aligned for the first time, that I had found the right place to be, and I was no longer afraid. And I'll be the first to admit, we were given the white glove treatment as far as arrests are concerned at that protest. By that point, it was really well orchestrated, and the police hauled us off for a few hours of processing and then let us go. But what I knew was that this was sort of my gateway drug to civil disobedience. I haven't yet found that role, though. That was 2011, and the last time that I got arrested for climate change. Sandra Steingraber, who's also a wonderful activist, she works a lot now on fracking in upstate New York, has a beautiful metaphor that she uses to talk about this. She says, we need to start playing the Save the World Symphony, and we each have a different instrument in that symphony. And I love that metaphor because it both respects our individuals' hearts and roles, where we find comfort and what it is ours to carry. And it also recognizes that we have a role altogether, that not any one of us as individual can carry the whole crisis, but that we belong in doing this work together. I also know that faithfulness to that small voice inside of me is one of the only things I have. And it asks me to do some pretty scary stuff sometimes. That it's not a voice of safety, but it's a voice that pushes me outside of my comfort zone and asks me to take risks. So I don't have any answers for how we individually can move out of worrying about the climate in our own homes, But I think that we're going to do it together, and it's part of the reason why I'm going to New York City and why I'm excited that we'll be gathering together there, is that I think we really need to do this as a whole, and we need to find our own roles within that broader movement. And I think those connections are going to get us to where we need to go.
Senator Christopher has a line, something like, we don't all have to be arrested. That's not the goal. But all of us need to find the thing that feels that risky. Because we're never going to change things if we worry about staying safe. Change is inherently the unknown. And in order to move in the direction that we need to move, we're going to have to take risks. For me, this experience of this blockade and then the attempted trial was that when we do bold things and act in authentically what is ours to do, people respond in kind. I'm going to tell the end of the story by just showing a short video that encapsulates some of what happened last Monday.
Ken Miller and J. O'Hara appreciate the Commonwealth's decision today to dismiss all criminal charges. Ken Ward and J. O'Hara stood up for what is right, and now DA Sutter has stood up for what is right. Thank you.
The decision that Robert Kidd and I, that's the Assistant District Attorney who handled this case, reached today was a decision that certainly took into consideration the cost to the taxpayers in Somerset, but was made with our concern for their children, the children of Bristol County and beyond, in mind. Climate change is one of the greatest crises our planet has ever faced. In my humble opinion, the political leadership on this issue has been gravely lacking. I am heartened that we were able to forge an agreement that both parties were pleased with and that appeared to satisfy the police and those here in sympathy with the individuals who were charged. I am also extremely pleased that we were able to reach an agreement that symbolizes our commitment at the Bristol County District Attorney's Office to take a leadership role on this issue. Amen. Well, I certainly will be in New York in 2 weeks. How's that? I'm walking around with Jonah Kiven's article from Rolling Stone. You know where my article is?
In fact, to keep in mind is they're still burning coal over there. In fact, they're burning twice as much coal last year than they did the year before. This is a plant that's supposed to be phasing out. That's the problem. I mean, we just found out this summer that the West Antarctic ice shelf is in collapse. Nothing we can do about it. 10 feet of sea level rise. In that context, it seems to me the only thing one can do is put yourself in the way. I mean, that's what we're facing. We have to stop this because the world is ending. And if you think about it, if you're approaching it from that point of view, what happens to us here is small.
So you're happy with the word that has been gotten out by the tech? I think for me, maybe Ken will say the same thing too. Doing this act would have been the right thing to do even if no one paid attention. And that's the sort of act that I think we all need to find in our heart that's correct and follow that through. It's just that responsibility, whether or not
When we do things that are bold and risky, it creates the space for others to step up and live into the truth that they also understand. I invite you and challenge you into that place. Thank you so much for being here.